Sam Goodwin
finally free.
What brought Goodwin to Syria?
Sam Goodwin, an American traveler, captured and imprisoned in Syria. For 62 days, he was in prison, unsure if he would survive. But after weeks of fear, came freedom. Stay tuned to hear some incredible stories about his life and untold experiences.
Hi, Rohan. Thanks for having me today. My name's Sam Goodwin, and I'm talking to you today from Tampa, Florida, in the United States, and really grateful for the invitation to be chatting. It was exciting to talk before this that you're based in Southeast Asia in Thailand, and I lived in Singapore for 6 years from 2012 to 2018, and really enjoyed my time in Southeast Asia. So this is a great opportunity to be reconnecting with that part of the world and specifically Thailand. So appreciate that. And just last week, I published my book. It's called Saving Sam. It's right here, and it went on sale on September 10th. And so was really appreciative of the opportunity to come on and talk a little bit about that story and some of the messages around it and things that I think can be helpful to some of the things that I learned that I think can be helpful to your listeners as well.
Sam Goodwin, thank you for that introduction, and you were very modest and almost reluctant to raise that book. So I'll request you to hold that book up as well. It's a fascinating read. So Sam, I'm gonna get into what is the book about, obviously, and that's probably the reason why we invited you on the podcast. But you mentioned you spent time in Singapore. You are an American citizen, and before I get into everything else, you've traveled to every country in the world as well. So you've done a lot in your life so far, and your story is quite unique. But tell us, what is the book about before we get into all the details?
So from 2010 to 2020, as you mentioned, I traveled to every country in the world, and like any worthwhile venture or endeavor in life, it wasn't without its challenges. And perhaps most notably in the spring of 2019, May of 2019, when I went to Syria, which was country 181 of 193, I was taken hostage and wrongfully imprisoned by the Syrians. I was accused of being an American spy and collaborating with terrorists, and things got pretty uncomfortable. They held me for 9 weeks in some not very good situations. And thank God, thanks to a long list of people who worked tirelessly, the situation ended peacefully. And in the wake of that, I've really been reflecting and trying to pull lessons and messages out that I think can be helpful to all of us. And that was really the inspiration for the book is you know, on one hand, I think it's an unforgettable story that includes this travel journey to every country in the world, heads of state, high stakes diplomacy, celebrities. But on the other hand, and I think more importantly, it's about what we all learned through this experience that we believe can help others today. It's about how we can all turn our own challenges and adversities into assets and opportunities. And so that was the crux of this book. I don't want to be known for the things that happened to me. I want to be known for the way I've responded to them. And I hope that this book can equip readers to adopt a similar mindset and implement it into their own personal, professional, and spiritual lives. But as I mentioned, the book is an unforgettable story, I think, that has a lot of drama, and I'm happy to talk about those details. But again, it on one hand, it's the details of the story, but I also hope that people take away lessons and messages that can be helpful to their own life.
Yeah. So thank you for going into the details. I've consumed a lot of content for this podcast because exactly as you mentioned, this story is about family, faith, perseverance. Nobody ever expects to be almost, you can say, abducted in a foreign land and thrown in a prison in solitary confinement. And you don't come from a military or that kind of a background. Also, your sports growing up, and your hockey pedigree, I can say as well, has helped you, and we'll cover that as well. But exactly to your point, one of the recurring themes, which you were trying to be not preachy or not trying to be seen as a hero, and correct me if I'm wrong, but almost saying that these were some of the things which I did when I was there, and obviously and there was quite a bit of luck element as well. Your family played a huge role, but yeah, you did the best you could under those very trying situations. But let's rewind back, Sam. Let's take it back to all the way when you were a small child. You come from a pretty big family. What is the Goodwin household? You were born in St. Louis, if I'm correct.
Yep. So I grew up originally from and grew up in St. Louis, which is not too far from the geographic center of the United States. So grew up in a pretty normal Midwestern family. I'm the oldest of five. I have two younger brothers and two younger sisters. My two brothers and I played a lot of hockey growing up. So a lot of our time as a family was spent traveling around the United States, usually in our car, going from one game or tournament to the next. And so hockey became a big part of my life, and particularly for my brothers. And then I went on, I was fortunate to have some success with the sport and went on to play Division I college hockey at Niagara University in upstate New York, and spent 4 years there from 2008 to 2012. So it was kind of a little bit about my upbringing.
It was so interesting for me that even when you were in prison, one of the things which kept you sane, or one of the things which you almost used as a compass, were the dates of the Stanley Cup finals. And for non-hockey people, they might not know what exactly I'm talking about, but your love for the St. Louis Blues was quite strong. Tell us a little bit about your connection with the Blues, and obviously their historic run coincided with rather unfortunate circumstances for yourself, but leading from once you started following them all the way to their run to the final.
Sure. So when I grew up in St. Louis, was a minor hockey player in the town, so of course was a Blues fan. And in fact, in St. Louis, the youth hockey scene has developed quite a bit as a result of former Blues players staying around in the city and helping to coach the players, the young players there, oftentimes their kids, and all of the players who are growing up there. And so the hockey scene there has become more developed than I think many people would realize. Oftentimes with hockey, we think of the 3 M's: Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Michigan. But it turns out there's quite a few great players coming out of St. Louis now, and that's one of the reasons. But anyways, fast forward to 2019, when I was taken hostage and totally cut off from the rest of the world. In that cell, there were a lot of things on my mind. And what I was most concerned about was my health and safety and staying alive, and of course, the well-being of my family, and all of these things that were happening. There was a lot to consider. And that's really what I cared about, was trying to stay alive, frankly, and also how my family was doing. However, one of the things that I learned was that in solitary confinement, it's very important to try to maintain a psychological connection to the outside, to the real world. And one of the ways that I did this was to think about what the St. Louis Blues, they were in the Stanley Cup final, which is the championship of the National Hockey League in North America. And it was, as you mentioned, kind of historic. It was they went on to win their first Stanley Cup in franchise history, beating the Boston Bruins in Game 7. I missed all of this because I was totally cut off. But thinking about how those games might have been going, what might have happened, was one thing that helped me maintain this connection. And I have to admit, I was in a situation where I frankly didn't really care about a hockey game. That was so far down the priority list because I was so much more concerned about my health and truly just surviving. But I did find a little bit of strength, and it sounds a little bit strange to even say this, but I found a little bit of strength in thinking about that as a way to maintain this connection to the outside and remain emotionally and psychologically in tune. So the blues became kind of a part of my experience in that way, as they had been a part of my life most of my upbringing.
Yeah. So we'll quickly come back a little bit. So you get your education, you play a bit of hockey, and then you said you started working in Singapore. So what led you to Singapore? Tell us a little bit about your career over there. And obviously along the way you had the traveling bug as well. So talk us through your journey from America to Singapore. And obviously I know that you've worked in other places as well, but Singapore was probably, the longest stay for you outside of the US.
When I graduated Niagara in 2012, I had an opportunity to help launch a tech startup business in Singapore. And I actually originally only planned to be in Singapore for about 3 months, but I ended up staying for 6 years. And it was a fantastic opportunity, a great way to begin my professional career. And during this time, I traveled as much as I could. I was in my early 20s in the heart of Southeast Asia, had the world's best airport in my backyard. And I just took advantage of the opportunity to explore as much of the region and beyond as possible. And just a personal preference when I traveled, I didn't like to repeat places. So even if I went somewhere and had a fantastic experience, the next weekend, the next holiday, the next opportunity I had, I would just go somewhere different. So I put this formula into play for about 6 years. And in early 2018, I realized that I had traveled to about 120 countries in the world. And it was at this point, I remember thinking, well, how many are there?
Yeah.
I always traveled because it was fun and I enjoyed it. But most importantly, I learned from it. Travel's the best education I've ever had. It was never about ticking boxes or checking places off a list. And I got to this point, I did a little bit of research and learned that there are 193 fully recognized UN sovereign states. And I thought, well, maybe I could go to all of them. And the competitive athlete in me kicked in and likes to work towards goals and achieve them. And that was where this travel journey really began in that sense.
Yeah. You're actually the third guest on my podcast who's been to every country in the world. This is
really?
Yes,
yes. Who are the others? Because a lot of us kind of are familiar with each other.
Sure. So I interviewed a British athlete who's run a marathon in every country in the world. Goes by the
Nick Butter.
Nick Butter, yes.
Yeah.
So Nick Butter has appeared on the show, and for me, it was such a fascinating interview with him because I thought I'll talk to him about recovery and how challenging it is to run. But we ended up spending a good part of the time talking about visas and logistics and how difficult it is. Like if he missed even one travel day, how that would throw his plans. And for me, it was so interesting. Like we went on almost a rabbit hole where we ended up discussing for quite a bit of detail on the podcast about the challenges of traveling and having to plan in advance. And obviously, he's running. So, but there were instances where he was shot at, where he ran on an airport strip. So that was one. And then one of my early guests on the podcast when we were audio only, he's Norwegian. He goes by the name of Bjorn Augestad. And he traveled to every country by the age of 29. And he also is an interesting character because when I talked to him, he was in Iraq. And at that time, COVID had not started, but there was some tension in Iraq, and he was kind of holed up. He'd just given a TED talk as well. So I must say that you're a great guest, Sam, but you're number 3 on the list of people who have been around the world.
Good for you for bringing them on. I'm sure they have fascinating stories. I haven't met either one of them, but we're kind of familiar. I'm familiar with their stories just through the traveler grapevine. And I have to say, I would have had a much more difficult time on my journey without the support of the so-called extreme travel community. And I've always appreciated the way that that we support each other, and the way that they supported me, and particularly with things like you said, like visas and just the logistics of it. A lot of that information that I got was from that community,
Yeah.
people like Nick and Bjorn. So I need to listen to those episodes.
Yeah, for sure. And next one is on video as well. So, but one more thing, I interviewed my guest prior to you is the #1 airline reviewer in the world. His name is Josh Cahill. And Josh,
Okay.
I don't know if he's traveled to every country in the world, but he's taken every airline in the world. You can bet your bottom
Oh,
dollar
wow.
on it. And this man
Wow.
is on a plane pretty much every week. And he's an interesting person as well. So chances are he's been to where you've been. And he can
Yeah.
give you a good review of how the flight was as well. So it just ends up being that I've had quite a few people with interesting lives, but interwoven with having been around the world.
That's great. Yeah, I need to watch that one too.
Yeah, but I'm a little bit curious, Sam, because you mentioned you reached 120 countries without, and I get, because I know how easy it is to travel within Southeast Asia. Literally, you get on a budget airline, you can go in and out pretty much within a day or two, or the weekend, and you can get to a few countries that way, or the Middle East, or the Asian subcontinent. But still, 120 countries is a lot. There must have been at some stage, whether I don't know if it's the 50 country mark, 60 country mark, 70 country mark, where you would have made a conscious decision that, okay, I want to go to a new place, but listen, I'm all done with Asia, or I'm all done with this region. So there must have been some planning going on, going from, I guess, 80 to 120, or it just happened organically.
There was a little bit of that. A lot of it, though, was just I didn't like to go to the same place. So weekends, holidays, would just try to go somewhere different. The other thing that happened was I would try during those 6 years when I was in Singapore, I would typically try to go home and see my family in the US, like at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, like summer or Christmas. And Singapore and the US are on other sides of the planet. So traveling, flights go both directions. So I would
Now
just,
it makes, and see, I don't know if you got
yeah.
this in any other interview, because now I can understand how you would have covered a lot more countries if you're
So,
traveling
right.
twice a year to the States from Singapore. Okay, I get it.
So on those trips, I would then try to stop
Mm.
somewhere for a few days or maybe a week and see whether it was in Europe or in
Yeah,
Asia or
yeah.
whichever direction
Okay.
made sense. So in addition to being based in Singapore, there were also those trips that also kind of fueled this whole journey.
Makes sense, and Singapore is such a great airport. You have the likes, you can connect to Turkey, you can connect to like it's up to you how you want to get your way around, and whether it's via Europe or now I see, because I was curious about this question, having traveled a little bit nowhere close to what you've done. I know we've segued away. We were supposed to talk a little bit more dark and Syria and prison and you being a spy and all of that good stuff. So
One thing I'll say about that is that, and I'm happy to share as many details about that as you're interested in. But it is kind of a little bit paradoxical because I, had this whole travel journey. I mean, I was planning to write a book about going to every country in the world, and then the situation happened in Syria, which was dramatic and significant. And it was a challenging time. There's been so much good that's come from it, though. But what I found is that I find myself not really talking about the travel journey itself as much as these 9 weeks, which it is what it is. But what I'm saying is I actually enjoy talking about. I enjoy this tangent of talking about the travel
I'll
as
tell you
well.
what, I'll invite you back on another episode just to
Yeah,
discuss
yeah,
travel. And I might do it with another guest who's maybe a traveler or something. So it'll be just a travel episode. How's that?
amazing. No, I
Yeah.
would love to.
Yeah, because I want to focus on the book. It's just come out right now, and I would be remiss if I didn't get to that. So for
Yeah.
me now, you've done Singapore, you've traveled, and now you're on a little bit of a quest to kind of travel every country, because from country number 120, it's on your, can we say, bucket list perhaps, that okay, you want to travel to every country, and maybe by perhaps a certain date as well.
Yeah. So it was about the 120 mark again, where I thought, well, oh, maybe I could go to all of them. I was learning that there were only a few people really who had done it. And so this all kind of fueled my thought process. And at that point, I will admit, my style of travel changed a little bit. I was moving a little bit more quickly. I also, my plan was to finish this journey, go to the 60-ish remaining countries, and then go back to my career. I said, so I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to travel to the rest of them. I think I can do it in maybe a year or so. And then I'm going to go back to my career, what I've been doing before. So my style of travel changed a little bit because I wanted to try to move a little bit faster. I don't really recommend that style of travel, but my travel goal had adjusted. My
Yeah.
goal with the objective had changed. So I started moving a little bit faster, and I didn't have unlimited time or unlimited money or unlimited resources or unlimited networking, people who I knew in different places. So I just did the best I could with what I had, and that was how this latter half of the kind of the
So
home stretch of this journey happened.
did you quit your job in Singapore when you were traveling after country 120, or a certain time, or were you still having a job and traveling when you were in Syria?
I left my job. So
Okay.
I planned to leave for a few months, about a year, and then come back to my career. But at the same time, I didn't have like unlimited time,
Yeah,
or I didn't
that
have
that
forever. So it was a balance. And the same, and this gets like fiercely debated amongst the extreme travel community, what counts as a visit and how long you go. And so for me, like, I didn't count airports. I didn't count just stepping over the border. Like, again, it was always about learning.
And so before we get into Syria, and I know I want to get into it, I absolutely love this quote. And I've written it down because I want to make sure that I print it. So never judge people by the actions of their government. And that's so relevant.
Like, one of the most significant things I learned through my travels is that places that are negatively perceived, or that Western media tells us we're not supposed to like, these were the same places where I had many of my best experiences and where my perspectives were most meaningfully impacted. And on my journey, safety was always the top priority. I don't think it's cool to be in unsafe situations. I don't go looking for trouble, but truly, these were the places where I had many of my best experiences. I've camped at the base of Angel Falls in Venezuela. I went to the Olympics in Sochi in Russia. I coached North Korea's national hockey team, as we were mentioning. I celebrated New Year's Eve on Kish Island in Iran. In Saudi Arabia, where you're from, I went to a Formula E race in Riyadh. Right, the Roman ruins of Leptis Magna in Libya are spectacular. So the list goes on, and despite the instability that was happening in Syria, I was confident that the same was going to be the case. And some of the best hospitality that I've experienced anywhere in the world is across the Middle East. It's among the most historically, religiously, culturally significant places in the world. The food, the people, the hospitality is fantastic. And just because our governments may disagree, it doesn't mean that we have to. And what I found is that the overwhelming majority of people in the world are well-intentioned, proud of their country, happy to help others. And that's what I found even in Syria, in a prison. I found that these were hospitable, well-intentioned people, despite the situation that we were in.
Okay. So what happens when you're coming to Syria from Iraq, correct?
Yep. So I came in from by land from Iraq, and just 2 hours after arriving, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide, when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. two armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was, at that point, I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. It was desperately trying to understand what was happening. And it turns out that these men were loyal to the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and told me that they were skeptical about my travel history and my travel motives. And as we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle, they accused me of espionage, of being an American spy and collaborating with terrorists. And this was country 181 of 193, and nothing like this had ever happened to me before.
Must have been extremely scary, different language, and being accused of a spy. I don't know if you understood it, but when did it hit you that you're in some serious deep trouble?
Well, from there, I was taken to Damascus and taken into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's Military Intelligence Prison, number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. And the officer in charge, he spoke a little bit of English, and he escorted me to this cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door and he said to me, he said, "Food, water, toilet, knock. Otherwise, quiet, no talking." And he slammed the door and left. And at that point, I think I started to feel, as you were mentioning, like I was in a tough situation. I was frankly stunned and in disbelief about what had happened in just a few short hours. My life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. I felt exactly the way they wanted me to. Hopeless, utterly cut off from any control of my life.
So when did you realize that there's no time limit, or you might be in here for a while? Like, was it day 2, day 3, or when did you get the feeling that, listen, this might be even worse than what I initially assumed, or you just conditioned your mind to take it a day at a time?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it was total shock. It was as if the floor of my life had been ripped out from underneath me dramatically and instantaneously. And initially, I was in disbelief. I was confused. I was frankly waiting for Ashton Kutcher to swing open the cell door and say, "You got punked."
Yeah.
That was how I felt. But as you mentioned, the most challenging part of the entire situation. So I spent in this cell. I went on to remain here in solitary confinement for 27 days. The only human interaction I had was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water. And the most challenging part of this situation, as you kind of mentioned, was the uncertainty of the situation, not knowing what was going to happen. And I sometimes say to some family and friends, or I say, so if I told you, Rohan, you're going to go and I'm going to put you in a dungeon in the Middle East. You're going to eat bread, boiled potatoes, and water. You're going to hear other people around you being tortured, but you're not going to be physically harmed. And on day 27, you're going to be let out. Now, I'm not saying that you'd be comfortable, but what I am saying is that you would be in a totally different situation knowing that finish line.
Yeah.
Knowing that on that date you're going to be released. The most challenging part for me was the uncertainty of the situation. So was I going to be released in 5 minutes? Well, based on the information I had, I thought that was possible. Was I going to be in that cell forever? I thought that was possible. Was I going to be released in a week? Were they going to open the door and just shoot me or torture me or stop feeding me? Based on the information I had, I believed all of these things were possible, and trying to entertain them 24/7 was emotionally and psychologically exhausting. And quickly, I'll just mention what I talk quite a bit about today are the ways that I embraced and managed this uncertainty. And this is what I'm hopeful can be helpful to others. But I found strength, frankly, by doing three key things. One was to lean into gratitude, which is a bit paradoxical. Two was to focus on controlling the things that I could control. And the third was to recognize the uncertainty of that situation as an opportunity for growth. And through those three initiatives, I managed to survive through those four weeks in solitary confinement.
How was your sleep like? Did you sleep uninterrupted? Would you wake up in the night? How many hours of sleep did you get?
Interestingly, in that cell in that first month, I slept relatively well on a concrete floor. And what I realized was that I wasn't physically tired because I wasn't doing much, but I became, as I was mentioning a minute ago, I became emotionally exhausted. I was so psychologically fatigued that by the time when it came time to actually go to sleep, I was wiped out, and I would sleep actually relatively well. I will say the worst part, the worst moments of being in solitary were the moment that my eyes opened in the morning. Because when I was asleep, I was somewhere else. I wasn't in that cell. I was in my dreams. I was somewhere else. And then when my eyes opened and I looked up at the ceiling, that concrete ceiling, and saw that I was still there, it was like a gut punch to start every day.
I know on a slightly lighthearted note, I cannot start my day without coffee. Are you a coffee person by any chance? And
I'm not a coffee person,
okay.
so thankfully that actually helped.
Okay. Because I know one of my challenges, God forbid I ever get into these situations, and I vaguely enough, sometimes I put myself in weird situations in my mind just to challenge it. And I try to ask myself, what would be my biggest challenge or fear? And somehow or the other, caffeine figures among the top of the list. And I don't know, that would probably, if I had no choice, I guess it would come down the list. But I do realize that, if you're a coffee drinker, most of my mornings are motivated by caffeine. So it's a good thing you are not into coffee. So so this happens, 27 days solitary confinement, and then you find yourself taken to another prison.
Yeah, on day 27, I was taken out of solitary confinement, taken across town to the outskirts of the city, and driven to a facility called Adra, which is I learned to be the country's central federal prison, and I was put in a cell with about 40 other men, and I remained here for the next 35 days, for another month. And although being in Adra was unquestionably an upgrade from solitary confinement, the other inmates it had its own challenges too, the lack of privacy and dealing with these other inmates and personalities and all of that. But the other inmates became friends. We cooked and shared food together. There was a prison basketball court, and I taught several of them how to play knockout. They taught me Arabic. I taught them English. They helped me smuggle out communication from the prison. And this is where, going back to the point that you made, this is where I was reminded through these men of many of the most important things that I had learned through my travels. And one of them being never judge people by the actions of their government. I also have learned through my travels something that was reinforced by these men, and that's people who have the least often give the most. Something I've found to be true in all corners of the world. And I've also learned that every person's why is the same. We all eat, sleep, breathe, want to be happy, are chasing some kind of goal. It's only the how that changes. And so with these men, I learned very quickly that virtually none of them were true criminals. They were just victims of a corrupt system and had been caught up in the instability of the conflict.
Yeah, seems like there's, bit of brotherhood which developed, and then, you went from almost like strangers and then developed certain skills and getting along, and then towards probably the end of it, I think some of them might even be your good mates, and then you realize that humanity, even with different languages, cultures, it comes through. I want to talk about, we've covered, a lot of these things, but we haven't touched upon family. And obviously you're on the inside, but your family on the outside. So you were talking to your mom when you first got picked up. And so she's a bit aware of, okay, things are not 100%. So take me through, perhaps in a brief time, but I want to get to the Stephanie conversation, because that just blew my mind. But before we get into that, your parents, obviously your family knows that something's wrong.
One of the most overwhelming things for me since this happened has been learning about all of the people who worked on my behalf to help find a solution, from people who loved me to people who had no idea who I was, and everywhere in between. And when I was trapped on the inside, I had no idea about anything that was happening on the outside. And the news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And when I stopped communicating, my family began to worry, and they started initially working with the US government, who told them that a lack of diplomatic ties were making it challenging for them to do much. And they also told them not to go public, to keep things out of the news, because that could pressure captors into potentially killing me. And a couple of weeks in, about 3 weeks into to this situation, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, I'm living in Nashville. She particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this, and just blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the US government of keeping all the communication very tight. So she decided that she was going to call her former college roommate, who, as you mentioned, is also named Stephanie. So there was this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it was, "Hey, how you doing?" And my Steph said, "Well, actually things aren't very good." And she goes on to explain, "My brother's been missing for weeks. Nobody's heard from him. We're working with all of these agencies and officials, and nobody's been able to help. And we're really scared." And roommate Steph says she's, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things, offers her full support. And at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, "Hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know." And my Steph responded almost jokingly or sarcastically. She said, "Well, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray." And kind of a light bulb went off, and roommate Steph said, "Wait, let me call you back." And it turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with General Abbas Ibrahim, a man who heads Lebanon's internal security, kind of like the equivalent of the FBI in the United States. And General Ibrahim was able to travel to Damascus and meet with his counterparts and mediate my release. And this became a situation where the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, the White House, Pope Francis was involved, Russians, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies, were all frankly struggling to be effective. But my sister's college roommate could identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in the Middle East.
The most surreal, I knew I wanted to get you on the podcast because I wanted to hear this, and I'm just getting goosebumps just listening to it, because a Hail Mary's intention, because if you throw it in the air, you intend for somebody to catch it, but it's still a prayer. This was, as you said, jokingly, almost like, as you said, her intention was not to get Stephanie to help because she had no idea she's Lebanese and knows anybody, but her intention was just to get this information out from her system, just share it, feel a bit lighter. And the cosmic world does mysterious things, and that leads to a series of chain of events leading to your release. So the most unlikeliest of phone calls, and I've heard in your other podcasts where she could have randomly called another friend, and who knows, you could have still been in Syria to this day, or it might have been a very different result. So it's one of the very bizarre, and this comes, I think if this doesn't make you, believe in fate, this doesn't make you a better human being. I don't know if anything else will.
Yeah, thanks. For me, there's really only one explanation that makes any sense. I believe God intervened. There's no other explanation that can make any sense to explain how this could have happened. So I view the world through a spiritual lens. I believe I was given this for a reason, and I feel really called to share it because I think others may have a similar reaction that you just had.
Yeah, it was just so surreal, and this is a little bit where, if this was in a movie, you'd say, ah, yeah, this is in a movie. But the fact that you're living proof that this happened goes to show you.
I think some of it, this is a case where a lot of times, or in this situation, the truth is stranger than fiction, and if it weren't true, people wouldn't believe it.
Yeah, so that leads to a chain of events where President Bashar is like, okay, this guy's all right.
Yeah, so my understanding is when Abbas Ibrahim intervened, they finally started to realize that I was who I was saying I was. I was not a threat to their national security or anything like that, and they released me. And I'll never forget arriving in Beirut, and when I walked into the Lebanese general's office, my parents were there, culminating this moment that was just indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and just this breathtaking display of God answering prayers.
You mentioned another thing, which there's a term you gave it, which is not PTSD, because I wanted to ask this question, but I won't because you've answered this. But what was the term which you used, which you're describing that you managed it, and it was very, very eloquent, and I felt very, makes a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah, it might have been sometimes in a lot of my speaking today, I talk about how a lot of us were familiar with PTSD, which I did experience mildly, and thankfully been surrounded by great people. But there's another medical term called PTG, and PTG is post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And I can take, for example, the hope that I cultivated in captivity and give it to others today. And uncertainty is a horrible thing to waste. As an athlete, entrepreneur, traveler, hostage, I'll tell you, Rohan, and all your listeners, that I believe there's value and opportunity in every experience. And that's what I'm focused on today, are these positives that have come from it.
Very well said. I think I didn't hear about this term prior to hearing about your story, but it reflects in terms of, there's certain things you can't forget, like your experience in the cell. I had another guest very quickly. Her name is Niloufar Hedayat. She's a Afghan refugee who went to work for the BBC and makes incredible documentaries. She talked about being smuggled as a child, and some of the smells which she still carries to this day, which takes her back to when she was 5 years old. And you can't, no matter where you are in life, it's you would still know what that concrete floor or that experience would be. Obviously, you don't want to go back to that, but as a human being who feels pain, has emotions, it is but natural to maybe once in a while go back to it, but then constructively use it for growth, as you mentioned. And it's okay to feel, I suppose, to have natural emotions as well, but how do you deal with it, and how do you grow with it? I think that's a great message.
Yeah, I'm trying, and I've been fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of great people, and I grateful to say I run my own speaking business today, and essentially I was my primary pillar is uncertainty, as we mentioned, and I was pushed to a point of overwhelming uncertainty, truly life or death. But through that, I learned some things, primarily those 3 points that I talk about, but these things that helped me and the things that I think can help all of us when we're facing uncertainty in our own personal and professional and spiritual lives.
And when did you decide that you wanted to write the book?
You know what? I've known for a while that I wanted to write a book. I wanted to maybe write a book about going to every country in the world. There aren't that many Americans who have lived and worked overseas for several years. So I wanted to write a book. And then when this happened, I essentially just realized that the book I wanted to write was this one. And it took some time to bring it together. And because one of the main reasons was because I realized that half the story wasn't even mine to tell. It was what happened on the outside with my family. And so the book is actually 2 stories. It's kind of like this Apollo 13-esque situation where there's this under-resourced entity stuck on the inside, and then this group of people on the outside trying to help them. And the difference is that in Apollo 13, they could talk to each other, but there's a similar structure here, but it took time to get to that structure and really do it justice. And a lot of times I think that when I think about my family side of it, I feel like they had the hard part. I feel like I had the easy part on the inside sometimes. So what they experienced was as extraordinary, or even more extraordinary than what happened to me. And that's why the book is told in this fashion. It's kind of 2 stories being pushed forward simultaneously.
Yeah. And what's the title of the book?
It's called Saving Sam. I have it right here, and it's available now everywhere books are sold. If you're interested in checking it out, please do. It is on sale now.
I suppose your story, even if it connects, and I guarantee it'll connect with somebody, it's what you're preaching, or what is your message from that is it resonated with me, I can tell you, and I guarantee it'll resonate with people out there. So you know, you didn't know it at that time, but it led you to this.
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time, and my presentations are narrative driven and include all of the dramatic elements of the stories, but it also weaves in and concludes with key principles that I think we can all implement into our own lives.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I've been finding it challenging to keep this, like this is probably one of the longer podcast interviews I've done, but I guarantee we could have talked another hour easy, just because there's so many other details which we haven't even gotten into, and obviously you can read a lot about it in the book, and I would urge people to pick it up. It's a fantastic read, or you know, you can even listen to it on Audible. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast, and thank you for making time, and wish you a lot more continued success, my friend.
Likewise, thanks so much for having me.